Welcome to Deep Transformation, Self-Society Spirit. I'm Roger Walsh, and our co-host is John Dupuy, author of the text, Integral Recovery. And our guest today is someone who's transformed my life and the life of many, many, many thousands of people. He's Joseph Goldstein, one of the world's best-known Buddhist meditation teachers. And Joseph has been practicing deeply for several decades now, well, about 5 of them. And Joseph, like a number of other meditation teachers, was a member of the Peace Corps. And in the Peace Corps, he was introduced to Buddhism and took up the practices, then spent about 7 years, better part of a decade, doing full-time practice in India. So very deep practice. When he came back here, he started teaching, co-founded the Insight Meditation Society, one of the best-known Vipassana meditation centers in the country, if not now the world. And I've spent over a year of my life tiptoeing around its halls under Joseph's guidance. And they were deeply transformative times, for which I'm very grateful. Joseph is also known for his books. The initial one was The Experience of Insight. And when I was in Asia in various practice centers, it was interesting to me to find Asian monks carrying Joseph's book in it. So like the practice or the Dharma had gone from east to west, but now is going from west to east, thanks to Joseph. He's also written a number of other books, all of which are remarkable for their rare combination of real depth and clarity. There's a real lucidity to Joseph's writing, which is beautiful. And as you'll see, to his mind, they're linked, as you can imagine. He's written, for example, Seeking the Heart of Wisdom with Jack Cornfield. Also, Mindfulness, a practical guide to awakening, and the book One Dharma, which looks for the common core of ideas and practice across different Buddhist traditions. And they're just wonderful books. I highly recommend them if you're interested in these central practices at the heart of Buddhism. And Joseph is interesting that he continues to practice. I think puts aside maybe 3 months each year for a long retreat. And it's interesting. Not all teachers continue to practice so deeply, which might be an interesting topic for us to discuss. But anyway, Joseph, you have touched me in my life so deeply. I'm so happy to have this chance of doing a dialogue with you and to dive into the many topics of shared interest. And there are so many places we can begin, but maybe let's start with you've done each year 3-month retreat. You're continuing to practice and teach. So what's on the edge for you these days?
Well, it's always the same edge, really. And the edge is not clinging and then seeing what I am clinging to, and that becomes the edge, in terms of, really furthering that freedom of the mind that comes from letting go. And, as you know very well, some of our attachments are very obvious to us, and we work with them in the various ways we do. But a lot of the attachments and clinging are really much more subtle, and they start to reveal themselves, at least for myself, most clearly in deep retreat practice. So that's why, for me, it's just such a great joy to take that retreat time every year. It's like the highlight of the year for me.
And you're pointing to one of the features of the progress of practice, that increase in subtlety, that one looks at deeper and deeper and more subtle and discerning ways, and thereby is able to recognize the things which impede our our well-being and our awakening and our happiness. And the very seeing into those tends to release them. So, and it's interesting you say that it's the same edge. That it. How would you conceive that edge? Is it a process of increasing subtlety? Do you see it like a spiral coming back to the same place? How do you see that?
There are so many different examples, which I can share a couple with you. And I'm not totally sure that there's a pattern to kind of the increased subtlety. As you know very well, having done yourself a lot of long retreats, we never quite know what's going to come up.
That's for sure.
And, we may think, well, yeah, everything's going along so smoothly, we're cruising along, and then all of a sudden, something comes up. Could say one of the interesting edges, perhaps, is even after all these years, a refinement of what mindfulness means. And we can be going along and thinking we're being quite mindful of what's arising. And then at a certain point, something arises that challenges that understanding. So I'll give you a few examples. This was one time when I was practicing in Burma with my teacher, Sayadaw Pandita. And I'd been there for a couple of months. Things were going seemingly pretty well. My body was quite open and energy flow and all that. But there was one kind of block in my energetic block. That even though most of the body felt really relaxed and open, there was this one spot. So I go in to report to Sayadaw, and I describe my experience, and I say, but there's this one block that really seems stuck. And he got on my case for calling it a block. Because even in that interpretation, aversion is embedded.
Okay.
No good, want to get rid of it. And so I thought I was being mindful, as I was experiencing it, and missing kind of that subtle level of aversion because of the concept I was laying on it, a block. Really, it was just different sensations, whether it was tightness or pressure or whatever it was. And it's just very interesting how our concepts about things often determine or condition our attitude about them. So if we call it a block, there's some kind of either resistance to it or wanting to get rid of it. If we talk about it or understand it, changing sensations of pressure, that would be a more genuine mindfulness. So just this, this is such a simple thing, but I hadn't recognized it until Sayadaw pointed it out to me.
Well, as probably somebody, not probably, but more of a Christian orientation with massive appropriations from other traditions. I mean, if that's a bad thing, I'm a bad boy, because I was certainly influenced by practicing in the time that we grew up in our generations. We had so much richness there. But I wanted to, and I would say, well, anyway, it's all God at some point, whether resistance or not, whatever arises, there it is. But how would you characterize, you've been doing this for many, many years, and I imagine in the beginning when you just had the realization, this is my path, like, oh my God, or oh my Buddha, whatever Buddhists say, this is it. And now you've been in that relationship for many decades, or, we don't have that many decades, but a number of decades. How would you characterize from that first kind of falling in love and honeymoon period to mature practitioner, teacher that you are today, have you noticed a change in the quality of your practice and what that feels like?
Yeah, so I have a new favorite definition of enlightenment, which is lightening up. You know? And in a way, even though I say it somewhat humorously, it does characterize, in my experience, the trajectory of the path, our subjective experience of it. And in the beginning, so another example, when I first began practice with my first teacher, Anagarika Munindra, I was really quite new to the practice, and of course was seeing all kinds of unwholesome things arise in my mind. So I go running to Munindra, basically saying, not in these exact words, but this was the message: "Oh, I'm such a terrible person. Look what's happening in my mind." And of course, he would just smile and say, "Just continue." But there was that kind of relationship, that kind of reactivity to what was arising. Whereas over all these years, there has been a lightening up. And so now, as different things arise, there's much more the quality of interest and investigation and understanding. So it's a much lighter, more spacious, more interesting way of practice. There's a phrase that I use now in teaching a lot, coming out of my own experience. The phrase I use is, "Don't waste your suffering." Meaning, very often people either are just drowning in it, whatever kind of the suffering happens to be, or blaming others for suffering or blaming circumstances, instead of really using the suffering that we're experiencing to investigate in our own minds, well, what's the cause of it? Because the suffering is within our own minds. It's always how we're relating to certain experiences. It's not about the experience itself. But that takes some spaciousness and practice to begin to relate to our own suffering with that kind of interest, rather than just being totally caught up in it. So that's all part of the lightening up, where...
Yeah, and I want to, there's so much in what you've said, Joseph. I want to emphasize some of it. One is this lightening up, and the second point is that the experience we have of something so much depends on our relationship to it. And that's key, and particularly suffering, as you pointed out. And it also seems like that relates back to your earlier point of the very way we label our experience, even in quite subtle ways, has a profound impact. And I guess actually it's interesting, I hadn't thought of this before, but what Sayadaw was showing you was the trap of labeling an experience in any way which implied a negative valence to it, and suggesting, and you in your own insight saw, there's another way of seeing this which is more fruitful and beneficial.
Yeah.
And I hadn't seen this before, but that's the heart of what in contemporary psychology is called the technique of reframing.
Mm-hmm.
Looking at an experience which is experienced as interpreted initially as problematic or an indication of something wrong with myself, and seeing it another way. That as you just did with the block, or as with so many people do with experienced so many bad things, I must be a bad person. Or you can reframe it, you're really a survivor. You've held in there and come through these very painful experiences. So very interesting to see these connections.
I'd like to reframe one aspect of what you said.
You're going to one-up me.
if I may.
I don't know. I'll have to think about this. Okay, go
Well,
ahead.
I think we'll be in agreement with this, because just as you were speaking, and I was thinking, well, the ultimate reframe, perhaps from a Buddhist perspective, almost always for most people, and even for deep practitioners, very often in one way or another, the frame is the I. I'm so bad, or I'm so good, or my pain, or my suffering, or whatever.
Yes.
Whatever the experience is, the kind of meta frame, it's mine, I, me, and mine. And so reframing experience in a way that frees us from that's really a very liberating reframe.
So instead of mine, what is the alternative?
Well, so I'll give you an example of one way I've been teaching the walking meditation. Right, I could give you a million examples, but this is what's coming to mind in the moment. So one of the things I noticed, first in my own experience and then in working with people, then just doing the walking meditation in whatever way one does it. It might be kind of the very slow zombie walk, or it could be a more relaxed walk. Even when we're experienced enough to be somewhat connected to the sensations, of the movement and the touch, it's so easy to have a very subtle and usually unnoticed overlay of concept of foot and leg. So even as we're connected with the actual sensations, but it's almost like it's a background frame of what's happening. And very often people will report, oh, I feel my foot. Right? But actually, we never feel the foot. There's no sensation called foot. But that's the immediate kind of conventional overlay. Very easy to go from foot to my foot. That's like a really easy segue. Well, my leg. So what I've been doing, or suggesting to people, and this came through my own experimentation, and it's one of the reasons I love being on retreat, because, you asked about the forward edge. In a way, the forward edge has more to do with the attitude of exploration rather than any particular thing. Because sometimes things come up that I wouldn't even have thought about exploring, but it just happens in the course of retreat. Okay, so I was just doing walking and I noticed this overlay, subtle. It's there's probably a psychological term for it, which I don't know. But I started then reframing it and actually using the noting of the elements. So in the walking, in moving, I would be noting air or air element, and touching the ground, earth or earth element. And so I was walking, kind of dropping into the feeling of the body, feeling the sensations of the movement and then the touch, but framing it as air element, earth element. And it was amazing to me. It's so incredibly simple, but it was amazing to me how that dropped the mind into a rather vivid experience of the selflessness of it, because there's much less likelihood of saying my air element or my earth element, whereas my leg and my foot is almost automatic. And so just a simple reframing in that way opens or has the potential to open us to quite a immediate and vivid experience, even if it's just a taste of it, selflessness, the impersonality of all the elements of the body.
Which is, and that certainly is one, if we look across traditions, that emphasis on selflessness is clearly one of Buddhism's main central teachings. And again, there's a lot in what you said, Joseph. So just to maybe name it as a way of emphasizing, you're pointing out that in our usual experience, or a conscious level of experience, there are usually layers of conceptualization overlaid on top of direct sensations. And we relate to the concepts more than the direct experience. And that's what's so incredibly, I mean, this can sound very airy-fairy in a way, but it's really important, because once you see that our lives are lived in relationship to what we overlay on our experience, and that the possibility of undercutting that, of going to the direct experience, is itself healing and transformative, that opens a lot.
Yeah, and just to add to that, or to embellish it a bit, what you're saying, it really points to such a significant point of deepening the practice when we drop from the conceptual level to the level of direct experience. And the reason, or one of the reasons it's so important, that shift, is that the concepts we use to describe an experience doesn't change. We leg today, leg tomorrow, leg yesterday. And so as long as we're on the level of concept, it reinforces some sense, even of relative permanence, right? That's it's the same thing, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And yet when we're on the level of direct experience, we could say the energetics of it, we see there's nothing lasting at all. Everything is in constant change, microscopic level, moment after moment. And as you know very well, the experience, in some way, I see one of the progressions of the path as being a refinement of the perception of change. This is just a little anecdote. Somebody once asked Suzuki Roshi, this guy said, I've been listening to your talks for years and I still don't understand it. Can you please express Buddhism in a nutshell? And Suzuki thought for a moment and he said, everything changes. And that, I so appreciate it, because even though everyone knows that on an intellectual, conceptual level, that's not an esoteric truth, that everything changes. But we're not living it, and we're not often directly perceiving it. And of course, it's the one doorway, or one support for non-clinging is through seeing that everything is changing. And the more we see it on a more and more refined level, we see that if we're clinging to that which changes,
we're in trouble.
And somebody came in, a meditator came in once to an interview having this insight, and they said, holding on to that which is impermanent is like rope burn. If you're holding on tightly to a rope and it's being pulled through your hand, the tighter you hold on, the more you suffer. And we see that. We see that on so many different levels.
Joseph, I'm pretty we were getting ready for this, and you sent us a 10.5 page paper that you've written, and I was like, 10.5 pages, no problem. And I was just, it took me a long time to. I feel so good after having completed it. I mean, I really got worked out in intellectually, spiritually, emotionally. It was really good for me. I want to thank you for that. And I want to bring out a couple of things that you talked about in that paper. And one of the things is that, we can have experiences of no self or emptiness. And, boom, when you were on the beach in Oaxaca and you took the mushrooms, in 1968, this amazing thing. And it's always an amazing thing, but it becomes more of a memory, instead of something that transforms you at the deepest levels. And then there's experiences that may be just the same, but they have a transformative aspect to them, that everything is different. It's never the same. And that's very mysterious. And I think it's very real too. But could you comment on that?
Yeah, well, I would like to hone in on one aspect of what you said, where you mentioned it may be the same experience, but in the one hand, it's transformative, and in another, it's not particularly. I would question whether it's actually the same experience, because as you know so well, there's such an incredible range of subtle and unusual experiences of consciousness, and some very refined states. And I think it's easy to misinterpret what we're experiencing. And here's where, having the guidance of a good teacher can be really helpful. Who has a lot of experience with at least some range of these very subtle states. So as I mentioned in that paper, for me, and I think in the Theravada tradition, at least, Buddhism, which I've been so connected to, the bottom line for assessing the transformative value of these different experiences is whether or not the defilements have been uprooted or not. Because that's the salient mark of, at least in this tradition, of the different stages of awakening or enlightenment. So if people have a very, to use a Buddhist term, far out experience, it may well be, a moment of genuine realization, but it may not be. It may be just another quite powerful experience. And the measure of it is, has the defilement been uprooted or not?
Joseph, can that be a gradual thing? In other words, you have experience and you get about a 30% relief, from your defilements and these clingings and all this stuff. And then with more practice, you have more experiences, but gradually it begins to recede until you're where you wanted to be when you started.
Well, I think that this points to the age-old Buddhist controversy of gradual and sudden awakening.
Sorry for stirring that pot. Yeah.
No, because I think it's a really important point, because in my mind, there was always a false dichotomy, that it's always gradual until it's sudden. And so in reference to your question, just through our practice, there is a diminishment. The stronger the mindfulness gets and the more insight we have, there's definitely a diminishment of the power of the defilements. And that moment, we could call it sudden awakening, is that moment when it's not only a diminishment of it, but an actual uprooting of it, so that it doesn't arise again. But those two are not disconnected. It's mostly, it's because there has been the gradual diminution of them.
When it finally happens, it's sudden.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. Done deal. That's awesome. Yeah.
But I just want to add one more thing, because this is something that I also think is really important and sometimes not understood that well. And we're going back to the whole notion of how we frame things. So there was, I think he was 11th century, Korean Zen master, Shinul, and there's a wonderful book of his teachings, and the book is called Tracing Back the Radiance. So his frame for the whole path, which I really loved, he called it sudden awakening, gradual cultivation. So he was highlighting the potential, even slightly different from what I was just talking about, but the potential for a sudden awakening, and again, whether that comes after a long period of practice, or sometimes, there are some people, for whatever background they have just have a sudden awakening. But what Shinul is saying is that even when there is that moment of sudden awakening, it needs a gradual cultivation, because especially in the first moments of awakening, or we could say the first stages of enlightenment, there are still many defilements left. And he uses a phrase, this will be a bit of a paraphrase, but he says something like, the hindrances are formidable. And so it's a mistake to think that one moment of realization will eradicate or uproot all of them. So therefore, even after that first moment, it takes a gradual cultivation to further weaken and uproot the rest. But he then goes on to say something which is equally important. But having had that moment of realization, then in the practice of gradual cultivation, we're relating to it completely differently. So our practice post moment of awakening really takes on a different flavor than the practice before. Yeah. But it still requires the further cultivation. And I just love that, because it just brings it all together.
Very helpful. Yes.
Very, very beautiful. Yes.
I feel, as we all know, unfortunately, a lot of teachers sometimes get into trouble. And one of the reasons I think that can happen is there may actually be moments of genuine realization, but then if there's the assumption, oh, well, I'm all done now, and everything I do is coming from this realization, so then all kinds of unwholesome actions can manifest. And so that's why I love the sudden awakening, gradual cultivation as being essential.
Yeah. Joseph, I keep wanting to start everything I say, but there's so much in what you've said, but there was a lot in what you just said. So I want to bring out some of them and continue where you're going. First off, I just want to note, I love and one of your gifts is the precision of your looking and conceptual and thinking about these. And one of the traps that's been intimated in a lot of what you said is that when we're not sufficiently precise in the way we think or in our looking, that's the root, that's a major root of suffering.
Yeah.
And so you just pointed to not just an integration of gradual practice, sudden awakening. You added in the gradual process of integration afterwards. So there was the cultivation, the an insight or realization or even awakening, and then a necessary process, which often seems to get skipped over. There
Yes.
has to be an integrative process. And one of the things that really stuck in my mind was when I was actually meditating with you, and I just limit myself to a page or two of reading each day. One thing was a Zen story, and someone had a Zen practitioner had an awakening, and the teacher said, "You must not teach for 2 years." I thought, okay. And
Yeah.
yes, that makes a lot of sense, because the deeper the experience, in some ways, the more time should be allowed for a real integration. We tend to have this almost magical presupposition about deep experiences, whether they're in practice or now contemporaneously with, say, psychedelics, that the experience will immediately do it all. And then we get a free ride afterwards. You're pointing to something much deeper and richer, that there needs to be an active working with after a deep insight.
Yeah, so this seems to be our pattern, Roger. So I'd like to just embellish a little bit more about what you
please do. We have a routine.
Yeah. So I agree totally with what you said. But I think it's actually more than just an integration of that experience, because until we're fully enlightened, that experience, even if it's touching the ultimate truth, is not the full experience of it. And so even afterwards, it has been transformative. We've touched, we can say we've touched bottom, or we touched zero, or we touched emptiness, whatever word we want to use. But the experience we had, how to say this? That there's further things to understand. So it's not just integrating that experience, but it's staying and continuing to stay at the forward edge of our practice, so it actually deepens further. And this is kind of a frame which I read once for why, at least in Theravada, but every tradition has its own map, but in the Theravada map, they talk about 4 stages of enlightenment. And I came across just this reference to the reason why enlightenment happens in 4 stages. And it said because for most people, there are exceptions, extraordinarily, gifted people spiritually, but for most people, because we are not open, or we're not able to open to the magnitude of suffering, to the magnitude of dukkha, right, which is the first noble truth. So in that first path, the first stage, we open to a significant extent. And this is really interesting. So we've uprooted at that point the view of self. We no longer have the belief in self because we've gone beyond it, in that moment. But interestingly enough, there's still desire in the mind, there's still aversion in the mind, there's still restlessness in the mind, still conceit in the mind. They're seen differently. They're seen as being impersonal, but those patterns are still there. So why is desire still there? Because we have not appreciated to the full extent the magnitude of dukkha, the first noble truth. And so our practice is a continual deepening, not only of that, it's a deepening of many other things as well. So I'll do this, just a little personal anecdote. When I first went to India and studying with Munindra, he loved talking about the Buddhist cosmology, and the devas and the different realms of existence and all of that. I loved it. A lot of the Westerners, they very skeptical, but I resonated with all of that. And then he described one path to full awakening, where he said, there's one path where you just go from the human realm to the lower heaven realms, to the next higher heaven realms, all the way up the scale, up to the Brahma realm, all of these, glorious realms of existence. And then full enlightenment. And being the greedy type personality that I am, I thought, oh, I like that path. It's just going from one kind of happiness to another higher, and then final liberation. So that was been in my mind all these years. Then I start studying with Sayadaw Pandita, and when I first met him, I hadn't known him before. And I don't know how it came up, but he asked me, what my aspiration is in practice. So I told him, well, this sounds like a pretty good way. He looked at me as if I had just said the stupidest thing in the world. It's like, from his frame, because he understood the First Noble Truth in a much deeper way than I had yet, to him, all of those realms still fall within the framework of the First Noble Truth. Right? So that's just what I mean of, it's not only integrating, that first moment of awakening, but it's actually a continuing deepening of our insights.
Going back to the paper and your summation, and I'm sure I'm paraphrasing this, but I would just like you to comment on the mystery, which seems a mystery to me, is that once you do this work, and through whatever agencies that you get rid of these defilements and these toxins and these cravings and these negative aspects that we've been able to create so well as human beings, that instead of just existential emptiness and voidness and nothingness and bye-bye, compassion arises, greater compassion, and your ability to transmit and do good in the service of other beings, increases. So what does that say about the deepest nature of reality? I find it awesome and deeply hope-giving and inspiring. So what is that mystery, and how do you account for that?
So I was sitting a 2-month Dzogchen retreat. This was kind of my first introduction to Tibetan Dzogchen practice, with a really great Dzogchen master, Nyoshul Ken Rinpoche. And he was giving a talk on bodhicitta. And somehow...
Joseph, could you just say what bodhicitta is? Because may not be familiar.
So bodhicitta is a central piece of Mahayana and Tibetan practice in particular. It can be described in different ways. In the most general way, bodhicitta refers to that aspiration to become awakened for the benefit of all, right? So it's not just for ourselves. There is another, you might call it a little more technical definition of bodhicitta, where they describe it on 2 levels: relative bodhicitta and ultimate bodhicitta. Relative bodhicitta is compassion. Ultimate bodhicitta is the experience of emptiness. And in one of the teachings it said, if these 2 are present, enlightenment is unavoidable. Okay, so I'm sitting this retreat. Rinpoche is giving this talk on bodhicitta. And it was really one of the most really transforming moments just in listening, where I realized through his teaching that compassion is the manifestation of emptiness. And I want to kind of just talk a little bit about compassion, because even though that's the term that's used a lot, and it's tremendous value, a word that I find more how to say, I feel a broader term to define that quality is responsiveness. So it takes it out of the realm only of being a particular feeling, although that is one of the aspects. We can have a feeling of compassion, but for me, compassion is much bigger than a feeling. It's just that innate capacity of responding to situations. So, for example, you're walking down the street and, or you meet somebody that's hungry, you feed them. And it can be a totally spontaneous move. It doesn't necessarily have to be go through any particular emotional quality, although that may be there. But the key to that responsiveness is the key to the responsiveness on the most basic level is really the understanding of selflessness. Because to the degree that we're empty of self, so then the responsiveness happens so organically, because there's no self-protection or I don't know, whatever the self would be doing in those situations. And so a phrase that I really like is, compassion is the activity of emptiness. Or there was another, there was another way of expressing it. It's not coming to mind at the moment. So this ties in for me in a really personal way, and it has to do with the Bodhisattva vow. And that's not really a part of the Theravada teachings mostly, although it's there, but it's not kind of highlighted. But I had come across, those teachings, and very inspiring. It's like, that's a beautiful thing to aspire to. But part of my mind always thought, it's a beautiful idea, but this is impossible. How am I going to save all beings? It seemed like a nice idea. And I didn't really see the nitty-gritty way of developing it. But then when I had this understanding of bodhicitta, that this responsiveness or compassion is the activity of emptiness, all of a sudden I understood the bodhisattva vow in a completely different way. Because at first, and where I had been somewhat doubtful about my own ability, in that sphere, because it's all resting on the shoulders of a self. When I started thinking, how can I take on this bodhisattva vow to save all beings? Resting on the shoulders of a self, it just seemed completely impossible. But when I understood responsiveness or compassionate responsiveness as the activity of selflessness, of emptiness, then it takes the me, the I, completely out of the picture. And so then it's just going through the world. I'll just, a little sidebar here. The expression for me of what expresses the Bodhisattva vow is the is the title of a book by Paul Gorman and Ram Dass back in the 70s. The title of the book was How Can I Help? And I love that title. And I've used it. I've really, I don't know what the word, it's become part of me. So that's, to me, that's the frame that can just describe the spontaneous responsiveness, that quality. And Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche had a beautiful expression of this. A bit of a paraphrase, but this is the gist. He said, when we realize the empty nature of phenomena, and we could say empty, selfless nature of phenomena, the energy to bring about the good of others dawns uncontrived and effortless. And I think that's just so beautiful that we take ourselves out of the way, and then that's the natural manifestation of emptiness of self is compassionate responsiveness. And
you're not responding, but you're being responded. In other words, you're not thinking, I'm going to go and fix this. You just
And the more open we are and the less self-referential, the more easily that happens.
And maybe we can do another round here, Joseph. I'll point out what you've said, and you'll point out what could be said better. So, three things come to mind in relation to that. One is the bodhisattvic expression, this expression of the commitment to the desire to awaken and hone oneself as an instrument of service and well-being and awakening for others. Alan Watts had a beautiful line which said, a person at this stage trusts their nature, which is nature itself, to do that which is called for. Now that's
perfect.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
Would you send me that quote? That expresses beautifully what I was trying to say.
And then another couple of stories. The sense of the bodhisattva aspiration, which is unfortunately often phrased as the bodhisattva vow, not I would love out of the depths of my being to become an optimal instrument of service for the welfare and awakening of all, but rather I vow to liberate all beings, which to me is very unskillful phrasing. But in one of the earliest retreats, and I think we may have been on one together, of the Dzogchen that Lama Surya Das did with a traditional Tibetan Buddhist teacher, every sitting began with, we're going to do the bodhisattva vow. After about a week or so, I stood up and said, it took me 9 years to make a vow to serve one being, my wife, let alone all beings. He was not impressed.
Yeah.
And a third thing I want to introduce is that there's a very important talk you gave early on when you just come back from Burma, practicing some of the loving kindness and compassion practices, and you said, usually I had thought, and I think a lot of us think of the desire to help and compassion as coming out of some aversion to suffering, some, got to get rid of this. And much of it does. But you had a line, you said, there is no aversion in compassion. And I remember I was so struck by it, I came up to you afterwards, you'd finished the talk and said, are you sure there's no aversion? And your response was wonderful. You said, why don't you try the practice? And you were right.
Well, yeah, to build on that a little bit.
Please.
So, at least in the Theravada framework, I think maybe there's something equivalent in Tibetan as well. But each of those Brahma-viharas of metta and compassion and empathetic joy and equanimity have what are called their near enemies. It's a mind state which kind of looks like it, but actually is not it and unskillful. So it's just an example. The near enemy of loving kindness is attachment. You know, the near enemy of compassion, and this was really interesting to me, is sorrow. And the point was that in sorrow there is aversion, but in compassion there isn't. And this became very real for me when I was doing sort of intensive compassion practice. And the way, at least one starts, is you think of a being who's in tremendous suffering, right? Because that's what will elicit, that response. So you imagine, you hold that image in your mind, and it's a very simple phrase. It's just the repetition of a single phrase. May you be free of suffering. May you be free of suffering. And because you're connected, with this being that is really in very obvious suffering, it really calls forth that wish, or that, may you be free of suffering. So doing this, like for weeks at a time, it was just so noticeable that even though the object, or the image which was used as the foundation for suffering, for compassion. So even though it was a situation of suffering, but in doing the compassion practice, it did not lead to sorrow. There was, and it's even hard to describe what word, but maybe we could call it open-heartedness, or something like that. It's that feel of connection and uplifting wish. So that's
Is sorrow the gateway to get to there?
Say again.
Well, I said, is sorrow something of the gateway to get to where you're talking about, to that place of deep compassion that is no longer overwhelmed? And you said in your story about the zero, you look at the zero and you see nothing, and you look through the zero and you see the universe. So I'm wondering if the zero in this case might be sorrow itself, and going through that is you get to real compassion and something,
Well, I think it would depend on how one is relating to the sorrow, because a lot of people, and in a way it's understandable. So I'm just commenting on, some common experiences. But often, especially in situations of intense suffering, it's easy to kind of get lost in the sorrow, or drown in the sorrow. And then that becomes the field out of which one is trying to operate. But if, there's some kind of awareness of this whole process, and, we might immediately, the first response might be sorrow, but then if we understand the nature of the mind and these different mind states, then we transfigure it, and we move from the sorrow to a compassionate response of how can I help?
Yes.
And in that moment, it's not sorrow anymore. It's like an uplifting energy in the face of suffering. How can I help, rather than, oh, this is so terrible, what can I do? Energetically, it's completely different. But for many people, and for myself as well, as you say, maybe that first initial response is of sorrow, but then it's what we do with that.
That was very personal. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. And certainly that I like your phrase, the uplift. It's an uplift. Compassion is uplifting. And I remember when I finally took your advice and actually did a retreat specifically focused on compassion and loving kindness, that literally within a few hours of the practice, this thought arose: I've spent my entire life misunderstanding compassion.
Yeah.
Very, very different. And I just
Yeah,
had,
and I think one of the aspects, and this is what happens so often. I mean, in a wide range of experiences, but it's the move from some degree of selfing to non-self, you know. And so when we're just lost in sorrow, there really can be a lot of selfing in that, a lot of I. And in that, what, you know, that description of compassion as being uplifting responsiveness, that really comes out of selflessness. It's not any one, it's not a self doing it. It's
yeah,
just that natural responsiveness, as Dilgo Kensei said, you know,
yeah,
when we realize emptiness, the energy to bring about the good of others dawns uncontrived and effortless. And I love that. It's just that spontaneous responsiveness. And that's the phrase, for me, it kind of captures it better even than compassion, which is a beautiful word.
yeah.
But I feel like it, yeah.
And spontaneous responsiveness is exactly the phrase which is used in Tibetan Buddhism for
Yeah.
for this. So it's like
That's
out of your sorry.
That's where I got it from.
Okay, well, that would explain it. You know, one of the repeated emphases here, Joseph, and not surprisingly, both from your own experience and from the tradition, is on the emphasis of seeing in direct experience that what we take to be a distinct self, a controller, an observer, an operator, decider, etc., is actually something added by the mind. It's a mental construction. And you also said that, you know, in an interview which you did recently, discussing a recent long retreat, that you'd had a still deeper insight into this and recognized a more subtle level of this. And I wonder if we might talk a little bit about these different levels of seeing. And I have a particular context or frame here. I recently began studying with an interesting approach by a man, Kevin Shenelak, who created a program working specifically with the 10 fetters. And it's a very interesting program. It's like, oh, people after 2,500 years are still coming up with new approaches, new ways in. And I'm, you know, beginner's stage with it, but I have found it helpful. And one of the distinctions he draws is between the belief, some presupposition of a self per se, and a subtler experience, a presupposition of a subjectivity, not a self per se, but just subjectivity, objectivity. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Do we have a few hours? Okay, so two things come to mind. Since you mentioned the framework of you mentioned the fetters or defilements?
Yeah, 10 fetters, yeah.
10 fetters, right. So in classical...
Which maybe you could just explain a little about.
Yeah, so in classical, at least in Theravada, and there's probably some equivalents, you know, in the other traditions, these are the unwholesome states of mind or patterns that keep us bound, you know, to samsara, keep us from being free. And so the first few fetters are this belief or view of self. Belief, the second one is belief that certain rites and rituals will free the mind, which the Buddha, and especially in the Buddha's time, there was a lot of belief in that. Right? These days, I think that's less of a problem. And then the third fetter is doubt, just doubt about the path and the practice, the teachings. And at that first stage of enlightenment, these first three fetters are uprooted. then there is desire and aversion. The next two fetters, they are only attenuated at the second stage of enlightenment and uprooted at the third. And then the last five has to do with attachment to different of the higher realms. So there are two fetters connected to that. And then restlessness, conceit, and ignorance. So those three, plus the attachment to the heaven worlds, they're not uprooted until full enlightenment. So this leads to a very interesting situation, because the view of self, the belief in self, has been uprooted at that first stage called stream entry. And yet conceit, and conceit in the Buddhist sense refers to any manifestation of I aming, right? I am relative to another person. I'm better than, I'm worse than, I'm the same as, or I aming over time. I was this in the past, I am this now, I will be in the future. So you can see that I am all centers around the I. So the question quite reasonably arises, well, if that sense of self has been uprooted at the first stage, why is there still the I aming until we're fully enlightened? But this becomes really clear in practice. So at that first stage, because we've experienced, it's what I call the experience of the zero center, which could be another way of the experience of emptiness, the experience of Nirvana, but it's that experience after which we realize that there is no self-center, that the center of this whole process is the zero center. So we know unmistakably that self is a construct, right? Because we've gone beyond it in our experience. However, there are still very deeply conditioned habit patterns of mind, one of which is this habit pattern of conceit, of I am. So as a habit pattern of mind, that's still there. But after the belief in self has been uprooted, we understand that pattern of I am as itself being selfless. It's just another impersonal habit pattern with the particular content of I aming. But we no longer take that to imply that there is a self, because that view has been liberated. So it's just an example of, even after we have gone beyond the view of self, deep habit patterns are still there. And that's what I think Chanel meant. Sudden realization is that uprooting of the sense of self, and then the need for gradual cultivation, because the habit patterns are so deeply conditioned.
And it's partly accepting the I aming, but not giving it very much energy, realizing it's just the leftovers from whatever that was.
Exactly. So I'll just share a little anecdote with you about this. This happened, I think it was just last year or the year before. You may be familiar with the monk Bhikkhu Analayo, German monk, he's a high power yogi, he's impressive. So he lives just down the road at the study center in his cottage. And we were both doing a self-retreat at the same time. So he was down in his cottage, I was doing it in my house. And it was a long, I think he may have even been on a year retreat. I don't remember. I was doing a 3-month retreat. And then somewhere in the middle of the retreat, I was just frittering away some time. I don't remember what I was doing. But then the thought came to me, I'll bet Analayo's not frittering away any time. And just that thought, I began to get a little down on myself. A little self-judgmental. Yeah. I mean, he's the real thing, and what am I doing, messing around here? But thanks, I think, to my many years of practice, it didn't take long. It took, I don't know, maybe I was in that kind of, self-judgmental, emotional place, I don't know, for 10 minutes or so. And then I realized, oh, that's just, the Pali word for conceit is mana, M-A-N-A. I thought, oh, that's just mana. It's just that pattern of comparing. As soon as I recognized it as being mana, the whole thing disappeared. The thought disappeared, all that emotional reaction to it disappeared, because it was just seeing clearly the impersonal nature, the non-self nature of mana itself. So having the clarity, and this is a point which I've just come to appreciate more and more recently, kind of appreciating the liberating power of recognizing the particular defilement that is creating the particular thought content, whatever it may be. So in this case, the thought content was, oh, I'll bet Analayo's not wasting his time, And as long as I was staying on that content level, I could get more easily caught up in it. Because it was true. He probably wasn't wasting his time, But as soon as I dropped from the level of the content of the thoughts to recognizing the defilement which was generating the thought, oh, that's just mana. It was in the recognition of the defilement, becoming mindful of it, that the whole thing evaporated.
And you were able to take that and use it in a noble way to refocus on your path, your work.
Yeah, absolutely. And but in a way, we started this conversation where you were asking me about the forward edge of practice. It's things like this. Sometimes it's just simple things where we find ourselves in a situation of suffering. And if we don't waste our suffering, but rather investigate it, it's when I was looking, oh, why am I so caught in this? Oh, that's just mana. That's conceit. So it's all these little things that actually are the forward edge of our practice.
So you're suggesting, first off, that the edge is always our current experience, what's arising in our current experience, and that the edge keeps presenting itself in each moment. We're never short of an edge if we bring awareness, mindfulness to it.
Yeah. Yes.
If we don't, it's a trap.
Yes.
Illusion.
And the edge does not depend on being on retreat, although a lot of these things reveal themselves on retreat, and I'm a great lover of it. But I've had really interesting edge-like experiences just in the world and in things that are happening. When we pay attention to our mind and we feel like we're caught in some suffering, just in our worldly lives, that's the edge for us, and that can be a place of really deep practice. So as much as I love retreat time and continue, to practice in that way, I think it's a mistake to limit our sense of exploration, or deepening to the retreat format, because it's all life. You know, and life takes different forms, but it's the same mind-body process. And so we can be learning, you know, profound things, not only on retreat, but just
moment by moment. And certainly that's one of the things I've taken away from your teaching is I remember you saying a number of times, continuity is the secret of success in this practice. Just continuous.
Yeah, that's great.
And with you, just a moment ago, you were talking about the power of recognizing a problematic pattern and being able to name it. And there's something very important in that general principle, that it can help, depending on how we relate, to have a map and to know what the traps and openings are. And that sometimes if we're not too lost in it, simply the recognition of what's going on, and particularly the naming of it, is enough to release.
Yeah. So just this point that you're making,
good, please,
kind of opens up to me a really interesting dimension of the practice and an understanding of what mindfulness is and isn't. So on one side, so in the Buddhist psychology, which you're very familiar with, mindfulness and perception are two different mental factors. They're two different qualities. And perception, at least in one of its main meanings, is that of recognition. You know, and that's where concepts come from. We perceive something and we put a concept on it. We recognize what it is. Oh, it's this. This is a tree, not a car, right? So that's perception. So on the one side, and again, this is all part of the Buddhist psychology, when it talks about what are the conditions, the supportive conditions for mindfulness to arise, one of the conditions is perception. Clear perception allows us to be mindful of what it is. So it's kind of like putting a frame around a picture. You know, we put the frame of a concept around an experience, and it enables us then to focus on the experience itself with mindfulness. So in one way, perception and recognition is a support for mindfulness. But on the other side, and this, I think this is really important for people who are practicing, to understand that not to conflate recognition and mindfulness, which people often do. And I did that in a big way in one particular situation, where I thought that because I was recognizing what was there, that I was being mindful of it. But so I'll condense a very long story, but I was working with fear. And this was a big, for a number of years in my practice, it was something that just kept coming up a lot. And I recognized, I knew it was fear, and I was noting fear and all of that, but it still felt very lodged in me. And then at a certain point, something shifted in my mind. This after years of working with it. And the thought came, if this fear is here for the rest of my life, it's okay.
Mm.
It's okay. And that was actually the first moment of acceptance. Because even when there was recognition, it was through the filter of wanting to get rid of it.
Yes.
Right? So it was through the filter of aversion, which I did not understand because I thought that the recognition itself was being mindful. And so I wasn't seeing the aversion. And as soon as I came to that place of acceptance, which is characteristic of mindfulness, it's amazing, the whole thing washed through. And it doesn't mean that fear never comes up again, but the whole relationship to it has changed. All based on being mindfully accepting. Oh, okay, this is just another passing emotion. So this understanding of recognition and mindfulness and not conflating the two, even as we understand that a clear recognition is a support for mindfulness, it's weaving those two understandings together.
And this is going to be a unique experience of me trying to get you to be more precise. But after having a lifetime of you and training me in this, but
go for it.
Would you say that could one say that you were mindful of the fear, but not mindful of the aversion to it?
I would not say that.
You wouldn't, okay.
No, because as long as the aversion was there, that if the aversion is there, I don't see that as being mindful of the fear. It feels like the mind, it was like looking at the mindfulness through a lens, right?
Yes.
Kind of an aversive lens. And this, I have a feeling, just reflecting a little bit about this point, I just have a feeling that this very point has probably been argued about a lot. of whether you can be mindful through the aversion, of what or not. But in my experience anyway, it just felt completely different when that filter was gone. And it felt because there was just a lot. It was sort of like the block, it's when I was framing it in terms of a block, there's not being mindful. So in this, with the aversion, I think that was what was feeding the aversion was an embedded sense of, oh, I'm such a fearful person. There was kind of an I somewhere embedded in it that was feeding the aversion and wanting to get rid of it. Whereas in the moment of acceptance, that sense of I was gone. It was no longer I'm afraid. It was just fear is another arising state. So it's in that way that I think I question whether there's real mindfulness there when it's this aversion fed by some I sense. Just doesn't feel ultimate.
So we could go in.
I have one more thing I can't get away without asking, if that's okay. And the idea of refuge. And when I hear that in the Buddhist sense, I think of interior peace. And I don't know if that's right on or not, but the idea of seeking refuge in the Sangha, in the Buddha, and in the Dharma, that's extremely appealing to me because I'm a good sufferer. I'm really good at
We all are.
Yeah. But is that something that can be there and present during your whole journey? Although you might be just a little baby, starting to meditate, starting to work on mindfulness, can that refuge that's provided in the transmission of the thousands of years of these people that have been pushing this ahead or going with it, something that we can dare I say, desire or hope for or experience on the path?
Definitely. And for me, a lot of what I notice, over all these years is a deepening of my understanding of refuge. And I think we experience it, and we can experience it on a lot of different levels. And just in the last recent period of time, there's one frame which I've really been feeling deeply: refuge as being held, and so, but this is just one level of it. But so when I take refuge in the Buddha and the Dharma and the Sangha, as I focus on each one, it feels I'm being held by the Buddha, and held by the Dharma, and held by the Sangha. And even as I'm doing it, I can feel that sense of being held in my body. It's almost like as I'm doing it, I feel my whole system relaxing into being held. And so but this is on this particular level. There are other levels, we could also talk about. In what I'm talking about now, I envision, when I'm doing refuge in this way, I'm envisioning the Buddha as the historical Buddha, having offered teachings. But one could also take refuge in the Buddha nature, so that's not so much the person as just in ultimate truth. So this is why I said, we could relate on different levels, and probably at different times we're just drawn to one level or another. But in my old age, I like the sense of being held.
Yeah.
And Joseph, one of the points that you've just made and you pointed to earlier was that there can be, and hopefully are, deepening understandings of some of the most basic ideas,
Yes.
common ideas. And you've just mentioned the idea of refuge, a central practice in Buddhism. The idea of we can trust in the
Yes.
Buddha, the teaching, the
Yeah.
community. You also mentioned it before, right at the beginning. You said your understanding of mindfulness had deepened, but we didn't go into that so much. Would you like to say more about it?
Well, I think.
Or do you think you've covered it in various ways?
No, well, I think that I was referring to, when I made that comment, was just that distinction between perception and mindfulness.
Okay.
Like not conflating recognition with being mindful.
A mere intellectual perception is different from mindfulness. That's somehow grokking it, I guess, to use a really...
I think it's the understanding that in recognition there can be, as I mentioned, just different filters through which we're seeing something. Whereas in mindfulness, there are not unwholesome fetters or unwholesome states of mind which are acting as a filter. I don't know, is that confusing?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're suggesting, in my recollection of some of the fundamental assumptions of Buddhist psychology, is that mindfulness, and to use some not exact but pointers, really being when one is really mindful, when it's really aware, when there's clear seeing, then the unwholesome mind states, the hindrances, the fetters, whatever names, are inhibited. They don't arise so much. You look,
Yeah.
I can see you're going to refine my comment.
I mean, it's a really interesting question. I think that is I think what you said is accurate. And another point is that with mindfulness, even when the unwholesome states do arise, we're relating to them in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the powers of mindfulness. So,
Mm-hmm.
because as we all know, we're practicing and lots of different mind states can arise. But when we're mindful, we're not caught up in them. We're seeing them as just impersonal mind states. So I think that's one of the gifts of mindfulness.
Yeah, and you mentioned before that that there'd been a real release for you when you had come to a point of acceptance with
Yes.
an aversion.
Yes.
And that seems such an important point. And that within the mind, it seems like there are two principles which I've felt are really important to recognize about aversion or resistance to having a particular experience. One is within the mind, what you resist persists. And the second one is what you're unwilling to experience runs your life. And really important principles. And somehow the one of the first steps with so many difficult experiences and states of mind is the paradoxical one of letting it be okay to have it.
Absolutely. That's why with my fear thing, and I said, if this fear is here for the rest of my life, it's okay. So it's okay became my mantra about anything, and particularly with unpleasant feelings or emotions or sensation. It's okay. It's okay to feel the unpleasant. So this brings me to one of my favorite teachings of the Buddha, which it just makes me sit up straight because it's such a high bar, but it's a high bar that inspires me. Where he said, as long as there's attachment to the pleasant and aversion to the unpleasant, liberation is impossible. And I just love it because it's so uncompromising, and yet it's addressing some of our deepest, almost hardwired conditioning. Of course, we don't like what's unpleasant or painful. And of course, we want what's pleasant. This is just the normal way of being a human being. And yet, from the perspective of liberation, this is the conditioning which keeps us bound. And of course, we know, and this comes a lot in, the development of the practice in meditation retreat, where even if we haven't reached that high bar of no attachment or aversion, but we can have many experiences along the way when we are experiencing unpleasant things, painful emotions, painful sensations, and the mind is really equanimous. It does not have aversion to it. And the same thing with pleasant. At first, oh, this feels great, I want more of this. But at a certain point, no, the mind is just, it's like space. And pleasant, unpleasant, in a very real way, in those times, becomes equal. Doesn't matter. So even if we're not fully accomplished in it, I think we can all get glimpses and even extended times of experiencing the freedom of that.
And since you've moved us towards the high end of the something or the deep end of the pool, we can continue because John earlier referenced one of the articles you sent us, which was on Nirvana, which the idea, the deepest or liberating, culminating experience of particularly Theravada, the classical Buddhism. And you raised some very interesting things about that. And so I want to just ask first if you'd just say, and here, of course, we're trying to be ineffable, what can't be described, but can you at least point us towards some understanding of this culminating experience and the very idea of there's a culminating experience of some kind?
So I'll use a very mundane example that I think everybody can relate to. And it's just obviously an analogy for it. But, I think we've all had the experience of being at home, maybe sitting in the kitchen, and just, nothing much happening, no particular noises or things like that. And we're just sitting, peacefully. And then all of a sudden, the hum of the refrigerator stops. And when it stops, realize that we hadn't even been aware that it was on until it stopped. It was just there, kind of in background, the ambient noise. But my experience, and I think this is relatively common, when it stops, there is a kind of settling into a different level of peace, of silence. It's like some level of agitation has ceased, right? Just going from that noise to silence. So if we think of this whole mind-body energetic process as being the refrigerator hum, and then we open to the experience, and again, call it Nirvana, call it zero, call it emptiness, where the hum of the whole energetic process stops, the experience of that is of such a profound peace. So that's one way of understanding. And the Buddha talked about the highest happiness is peace. And so that experience is like of the ultimate peace, the unborn, the unformed, the unfabricated, all those terms for it. But there's another meaning of nirvana, nibbana, which I think is also really important to talk about, because another way that term is being used is to describe the mind free of defilements. And in the Pali text, there's very specific statements where the Buddha is describing Nibbana as the cessation of greed, hatred, delusion. So in that, he's not only referring to that stilling of the hum, but also to the transformative effect on the mind of having had that experience. And then also using the term Nibbana to describe that mind that has been freed from these disturbing influences. So it really, and I think it's really helpful to understand that it can refer to both aspects. So to that aspect, which we could call transcendent, and the other aspect, I don't know if I'm using this correctly, but could we say the absence of the defilements or the eradication of the defilements, that state of mind is imminent as opposed to transcendent? So I'm not sure I'm using those terms correctly.
Mm-hmm. But they're pointing to something very important, two possible understandings of this. And as you point out in your article, one of the key characteristics of this experience, Nibbana, is, and I'll just mention that for various reasons you're pointing out the other term that's often used for Nirvana has been so misused in the West now that's lost a lot of its depth. So sticking with the original Pali term, Nibbana, that this experience has dramatic transformative capacities.
Yes.
There's something about this, unique about this experience.
Yes. And what's unique, I mean, there are many things, namely the absence of the hum, but what's also unique about it is that it has the power to uproot the defilements and stages which are causing the hum. So it has both of those levels, and they're both true. It's not that they're different interpretations of Nibbana. It's just different aspects of what that word refers to.
And what is it that is so distinctive about this experience as compared to the other myriad, as you pointed out, experiences, profound and wonderful, that can occur along the path, that has such transformative power? What is that?
Well, if I'm understanding the question, you're asking, well, why does the experience of Nibbana, uproot the defilements? Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah. Why this experience of the millions of others that we have?
So, generally speaking, and I don't know if this is going to be a universal statement, but it's where I incline that why questions are less helpful than what questions. And so the why it happens, you have to ask the Buddha. The what happens, that anybody who's been through those experiences can tell you what happened. Which is why, all of the Buddhist traditions, these paths, whatever particular tradition and unfolding map is used, as you know, these are well-trodden paths for thousands of years. People have walked on it and practiced and experienced the same what. You do this, and then this happens. So that just, to me, seems that's a more answerable question, at least from where I'm at. The Buddha could probably, undoubtedly would be able to give you a fuller response.
And he's still around, I take it.
Well,
yeah.
Is that a statement, a question?
No, it's kind of a question and a statement, but it's a deep belief. I think these presences, these great teachers of the past, are in some sense beyond time and are accessible in some mysterious way. And boy, talk about why and how, I don't know, but that's my, and so it's
well, probably certainly in different traditions, and even different people within the tradition will have different senses of that. So from a classical Theravada sense, I think the way that what you said would be understood, but I think it may be slightly different than the way you're holding it, where the Buddha said, those who see the Dharma see the Buddha, right? And so if we're just framing it in terms of, in some way, the Buddha is still around, it would really require a little investigation of what you mean as you're using the term Buddha. If you're using it in some sense as a being on some level, that's one thing. If you're using it as a synonym for the Dharma, that's another thing. Yeah. And so people may have different, understandings or beliefs, but it would depend on how they're holding what the term Buddha refers to.
And Joseph, in one of the recurrent themes here has been that so much depends on the way one holds it, one's perspective, one's presuppositions. And you mentioned different paths, and one of the emphases of your article on Nirvana was that there's controversy about exact interpretations, the way it's held, etc. And even more if we look across paths, because, or even within different schools of Buddhism, but looking across paths, there's the assumption in classical Theravadan Buddhism that there is a culminating experience. And if we look elsewhere, say, there can be an assumption that actually there can be a series of culminating experiences, perhaps never ending, always deepening, that each awakening can be a portal to a deeper awakening. I think particularly of in the Buddhist tradition of Dogen, the great Zen master, and in our own time, the teachings of A.H. Almas, who founded the Diamond Work, who's very clear that, to quote him as best I can, well, people ask if I've ever been enlightened. I say, yeah, many times, and people often say, oh, that's the final experience, but I always find there's something more. And so it's a different perspective. I'd love to have your thoughts.
I have a very simple response to that. And it's actually one of my favorite mantras. Who knows? I mean, we can, even great teachers, who knows? It's like we're having an opinion about, at least with reference to this particular question, about the ultimate end or not end of a path.
Mm-hmm.
So on what basis could anybody claim to have the definitive understanding of that? And so for me, with questions like that, for me, that mantra, who knows, is not one of confusion. It's just one of openness. It's like realizing, I don't know, and so I just keep walking on the path and see what happens.
Well, Joseph, for a not knowing person, your article was amazing. And is that available to just regular mortals out on the street? Can we look Joseph Goldstein, Nirvana, and find?
I don't know if I don't know where it would be found at the moment.
Well, can we release it with this podcast? Would that be okay?
Sure.
Thank you.
I don't know how many mortal beings will be interested in it, but you're welcome to
find out.
Yeah, we'll find out. So, Joseph, as we've covered a lot here, and let's just take a little time before we end to look back. You've been practicing some 50 years and going as deep as you're just spending a lot of time devoting your life to this in a very wholehearted way. As you look back, are there any reflections you have on I wish I'd known that 20, 30 years or 40 years ago?
Every it's not so much of what I wish I knew then that I know now, because I think that's our whole life is often like that. We make mistakes and then we learn from our mistakes, and that's just the process. But for me, what really has been there from the beginning and has sustained my interest, my deep interest over all these years, is the quality of interest. And when I first went to India, looking for a teacher, ended up, traveled around India ended up in Bodh Gaya, met Munindraji, my first teacher, and he said something that was just so simple and so straightforward. It completely hooked me. And I was young. I was just, I think 23 at the time. He said, if you want to understand your mind, sit down and observe it. There's nothing to join. There was no ritual, no ceremony, nothing. If you want to understand your mind, sit down and observe it. And it just made so much sense to me, because how else can we understand our minds, ourselves, our being, except by it's not limited to sitting down. We could do it standing up or lying down. But it's that process of interest in our own inner experience. And as I said, earlier, not to waste our suffering, and having the difficulties and the challenges actually piquing our interest. Oh, can I understand this? So that's, for whatever reason, that's been a part of my makeup from early on, but I so appreciate it because it's just sustained this incredible interest in deepening, ever-deepening understanding. So to me, that's the key. If people understand a methodology that works for them, and they're interested enough to keep walking on the path, in a way, liberation is inevitable. Because, as we said, this has been a well-trodden path. So that just gives me a lot of joy, and is so fulfilling in life, because we're just taking all of our life's experience, whatever it is, the great times and the difficult times, but it all becomes, as Ram Dass would say, grist for the mill. It's all part of it. And so to me, it's just a really fulfilling way of life.
I resonate completely, and I think one of the hooks for me has certainly been something similar. I've called it curiosity, but I think interest. And it seems that we underestimate the value and potency of interest as a quality of mind. And it was really brought home to me by a woman, Anjali Zarian, who was a wonderful Basque shaman, a very wise woman. And she led groups of reconciliation groups around the world, in Ireland and in South Africa. And I had the good fortune of being at a dinner with her just after she'd led what she just, as we were talking, she said was the most difficult group she'd ever led. It's like, whoa, this is a woman who's been through the fire. And so, of course, I want to know, well, what did you do? And she said, I kept saying to myself, stay interested, stay interested.
Yes. Yeah. Just to tie that quality of interest back to the classical teachings, it's actually one of the factors of enlightenment. It's called investigation of dhammas, investigation of the truth, of the elements, So it's right there as a kind of key element of the whole path. And it certainly, I feel it's borne out in our experience.
Yeah. Joseph, as we kind of close, I wonder if I'd like to just have your reflections on the application of some of these insights and ideas and practices to the larger issues. We're in a new time in human history, which the first time in history, the very world civilization is at risk because of the very foibles, human foibles, the greed, hatred, delusion, neuroses, etc., that you've devoted, and this whole Buddhist path has devoted its being to understanding. And yet the responses to the great threats of our time, whether they're nuclear war or starvation or pollution or ecological collapse, almost invariably are outer responses: political, military, economic, etc. And the underlying psychological and spiritual dysfunctions get overlooked. And yet, if we look deeply, it seems like our global problems are actually global symptoms. They're symptoms of our individual and collective psychological, spiritual dysfunctions. And if we only respond to the symptoms, the underlying dynamics are just going to keep perpetuating or even exacerbating problems. So I'd love to have your reflections on these great issues.
Well, I totally agree with what you just said. That, and the Buddha kind of, he laid it out very clearly, is, the root causes of suffering in the world are greed, hatred, and delusion, and all the manifestations of those states. And I totally agree with you that the real resolution will be the growing ability of more and more people to be looking deeply, into their own minds, and working to diminish and eventually eradicate. Part of my frame, and this is how to say this, I think for many people in the West, they will not be able to relate to what I'm about to say. It definitely comes out of the Buddhist teachings, but it's not a part of the teachings that are very accessible to most people. And even for myself, they're really taken on faith at this point. But as the teachings have been expressed in the West, the part that we almost always leave out is the whole Buddhist cosmology, and kind of different planes of existence and rebirth and different world systems. So the cosmology is vast. And when you read the texts, it's right there. It's almost on every page. The Buddha interacting with beings from all different realms of existence and describing the larger cosmology. Now, I understand that, to many people in the West, especially kind of with the Western scientific paradigm, unless one has developed the mind to such an extent that can be those aspects, the cosmological understanding, can be experienced directly, it's understandable that people are very skeptical about this. And we don't talk about it a lot, for just that reason. But I'm just sharing my own personal, for me, and it's not that I've had experience of all that, but both because it's my inclination, having really studied a lot of the teachings and seeing how embedded these understandings are, and having practiced with teachers who have cultivated their minds to the extent where they can experience all that. So I'm putting this out because, and again, this is just very personal. I understand that it may not be the way most people can hold it or even maybe interested in holding it. But for me, that very large, vast understanding of the nature of the universe in many mysterious ways, mysterious to us now, gives a very different perspective on what's going on. And for me, it's a help for me, even as I, do my life's work is in, trying to share the Dharma and help people really look at purifying the mind. But this much more vast sense of what's going on. It's a source of a kind of equanimity that can hold the tremendous amount of suffering that is just on this planet at this time, you know. And this again is a very interesting, somehow I think it's been helpful for me to integrate kind of this hugely vast perspective with what the moment calls for in compassionate response. You know, because a danger of that vast perspective is we become indifferent. Okay, you know, this planet's going to blow up in 4.5 billion years anyway. You know, and there are other planes of existence and all of that, which I believe to be true, but that doesn't negate the imperative to address the actual suffering that's going on now. You know, but it can help us hold it in a different way and in a more equanimous way, even as we respond with as much compassion as possible. And so it's this balance of equanimity and compassion, which I think makes possible effective response.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Anyway, I was very moved by that. And what a wonderful summation.
Yeah.
Doing. Thank you. Good question.
Yeah. Thank you, Joseph. So just to acknowledge the beauty of that, that again, one of the magical words that's come up several times, integration, the holding of the biggest possible perspective, opening to the biggest experience and understanding we can, while simultaneously working as skillfully and effectively as we can, both on ourselves to attenuate the causative dysfunctions that lie at the root of our global tragedies, and simultaneously working in the world to relieve the issues and the underlying causes. Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Joseph, this has been such a gift. It's so much fun just to sit down with you and investigate or bring interest to all number of topics, as you said. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. It is a lot of fun.
Yeah, and I just feel really honored to be in the presence of both of you, two elders who've just been on this path for a long time, and it's really been good for me. And I'm sure that our listeners are going to find the same sort of goodness from participating in this. So thank you so much, both of you.
Oh, thank you. What a gift.